Thanks so much for joining us on this Sunday morning. The fight for the besieged eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut is intensifying as Russian forces further advance this weekend. Ukrainian troops are still holding on to the city, and the latest British military intelligence suggests an increase in close combat on the streets. As we mentioned there, Canada's Chief of the Defence Staff was in Ukraine for his first visit since the Russian invasion to discuss the current state of the war and, of course, cooperation with Canada.
Really important that we acted together, that we organized our lockstep.
This critical moment is also being felt outside of Ukraine. On Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden hosted German Chancellor Olaf Scholz for a working visit in Washington. The two leaders presented a united front, reinforcing that their military support for Ukraine would go on for as long as it takes. The length of the war and how it could end is something Michael Ignatieff has been thinking about. Earlier, I spoke to the former Liberal Party leader and now professor of history at the Central European University about possible outcomes. Mr. Ignatieff, nice to see you again. Appreciate you being here.
Nice to be here, Rosemary.
1 year into this war, and the West is certainly putting out a united front and says that it will stay as long as is needed and will support Ukraine as long as needed. But there are still obviously questions about how this ends. What are we seeing so far that would give you a sign about whether anyone has any idea of how this ends?
I don't think anybody truthfully knows how it ends. It's going to be decided on the battlefield. Long way from Washington and Ottawa and Paris and Berlin. It's going to be decided in Bakhmut and Zaporizhia and these places we follow every night on the news. But at the moment, it looks as if the Russians are about to are in the middle of an offensive, and the Ukrainians are hoping in the spring to start a counteroffensive. And I think by the end of the summer, we're going to know whether the current stalemate's been broken. But it's a battlefield story at the moment. Although there are lots of people on the sidelines who are proposing that it should end this way and that, I just think it's the battlefield that matters.
And why do you say that? Why is a negotiated peace or ceasefire not the route for this particular conflict?
Well, the Ukrainians are fighting for their very survival. I mean, the Russians have decided they want to eliminate Ukraine as a state. So there's nothing to negotiate from the Ukrainian side until they've established their territorial sovereignty over as much of their terrain as they possibly can, hopefully all of it. And so the Ukrainians have no incentive to negotiate. And Putin has set himself the goal of eliminating Ukraine, and so the two are at loggerheads in terms of ultimate objectives, and that's where we remain. And it will be the battlefield that decides how much each of them are finally prepared to accept. I mean, the Russians may conclude they cannot conquer Ukraine. I certainly hope they make that judgment as soon as possible. But they may determine that they have to hold on to Crimea and Donbass, and that would be their negotiating position. Then the Ukrainians may discover at the end of the summer that they just can't dislodge the Russians from Donbass and Crimea, and then they may have to be forced to a negotiation. But again, I think it's not right for outsiders like me to pontificate about what Ukraine should or shouldn't do. It depends what they can achieve on the battlefield.
So let me ask you then, if on Friday the German Chancellor is meeting with President Biden, and we are expecting the two of them to discuss the end game here. And I think that's because there is pressure on both of them to understand how long they can keep giving money and supplies to Ukraine, maybe particularly President Biden under that kind of pressure. Do you think that that factors into it, these external pressures, given the West and NATO are funding Ukraine's counteroffensive?
Oh, I'm sure these pressures weigh in. President Biden has an election in 2024. German Chancellor is under continual pressure from domestic opinion in Germany. Yeah. These are politicians. They have to read public opinion, and I think there are signs that both in the United States and in Germany, people are asking, how long does this go on? I think they've also discovered that their weapons supplies are running short. We're stripping out capacity in Canada, Germany, United States to help the Ukrainians, and discovering that we're a little short of the things we need to defend ourselves. So all these are playing into increased pressure. I think there's a deeper thing going on here, though, Rosemary, which is that Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, and their hatred of the Russians is deep and it's justified. But Biden and Schultz live in a world where, when this is over, they have to live with the Russians. And at that point, a divergence emerges between what Biden and Schultz want and what Zelensky wants. It's just inevitable. It's not a matter of betraying Zelensky. It's just that the external powers and the Ukraine have different ultimate objectives here. Ukraine's ultimate objective is to throw the Russians out of the entirety of Ukrainian territory. And there isn't a person, certainly not me, who doesn't understand and sympathize with that. Yeah. But that's not necessarily the objective of Biden and Schultz. They have to live in a world where Russia will continue to be on the eastern border of Europe. And they may even want a Russia that has Putin at the end of the day in power, rather than a more right-wing and terrifying opponent in the chair in Moscow, or even worse, a Russia that is split up into civil war following Russian defeat. So the uncomfortable thing we have to look at is that Ukraine wants to win, and the West wants Ukraine to survive. And those are not the same objectives.
And is that also not only because the West has to deal with Russia after, but because there is a fear, and I think you wrote this in your op-ed in the Globe, about how this, the longer it goes on, the bloodier it could get, and the more everyone else becomes at risk as well?
Yes, there's always been a scenario from the very beginning of this conflict that if Russia was actually defeated on the battlefield, that is, if it felt it was going to lose Crimea, that Putin would unleash tactical nuclear weapons and take us into a whole new world. I don't think this is I wouldn't rate the risk of this being very high, but the risk is not zero, is all. Right. And so Biden and Schultz have to think about that. And they may come to the conclusion that better a Russia that comes to the negotiating table than a Russia defeated. And again, you see there's a divergence. Ukraine wants a Russia defeated, and everybody understands that. But Schultz and Biden may simply want a Russia at the negotiating table, conceding the territorial integrity of what remains of Ukraine while holding on to Donbass and Crimea. And this is the ultimate, I think, conflict that's going to emerge over the next year. But I have every sympathy for Ukrainians watching this program that don't want to hear this. Yeah. I wouldn't want to hear this if I was in the Ukrainian situation, because they're truly fighting for their lives, and everybody wants this extraordinary democratic experiment to both survive and prosper and rebuild.
As a historian and someone who has studied past conflicts, where do you fit this one into where we are in the world, or into the sort of the world order? How do you view this particular conflict at this moment with the historical perspective you can bring to it?
Well, I think there are two perspectives. One of them, which some people are pointing out, is Korea. Korea ended, the Korean War of 1950-52 ended in a kind of standoff in which you ended up with a North Korea, communist North Korea, which is this kind of kleptocratic, crazy regime. And in the South, a buoyant, democratic, it's a fantastic place, South Korea, but it's still, actually at war, or the conflict has not ended. That's one possible scenario. And you could envisage a Ukraine that survives. It's not the whole of the Ukraine, but it's a vibrant democratic society side by side, a wounded bear. And maybe that's a future. But I understand it when the Ukrainians say that's not a future that gives us any security. So a future Ukraine is going to have a security have the capacity to defend itself militarily, is going to have early entry into the European Union. This is where you could begin to see a stable future for Ukraine. But, you know, your question was broader than that. It was about this order, supposed order. We're in the middle of the destruction of the post-'89 global order. And that's what makes everybody who looks at this very concerned. Order, where's the order? Where's the order in relation to China? Where's the order in relation to Russia? These are Russia has ripped up the UN Charter, has ripped up every legal framework that used to give us that order. And that's why this is a scary world. And I think it's foolish for me to predict how this is going to settle out. Our objective, which is the right one, is to make sure that Ukraine survives, rebuilds, and reestablishes itself as a functioning democracy yoked forever to Europe. That's the objective I can see, and that's the one we must defend.
Last question, and it'll be a more in terms of Canada. Obviously, we've been supporting Ukraine in a variety of different ways to the extent that we can, given limitations, particularly military limitations. Do you think that Canada is doing enough, playing the role that it should, given its close ties to Ukraine?
We do have historic ties. I mean, they're deeply emotional ties. I mean, 1 million Canadians have Ukrainian origins, and their hearts beat faster at the very mention of Ukraine. And it's appropriate that should drive Canadian foreign policy. I think it's a little disappointment, frankly, that our military is so depleted that we haven't been able to support them with the military capabilities that they need. There's no question of our diplomatic support. I think there's no question of our economic support. And I think Canadians are going to have to swallow hard and understand, even at a time it's not particularly easy for Canada, that we are going to have to sustain a constant, decade-long commitment to rebuild Ukraine once the shooting stops.
Mr. Ignatieff, so nice to see you again. I really appreciate your perspective on this. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Rosemary. Thanks so much.